So this masterpiece starts with showing one very handsome dude sitting on a bench moping while feeding pigeons. Why is this handsome dude moping? And why is he dressed so well? Well, I have to take you back to a little over 100 years. To the first episode. Tyrion Lannister decides he wants to bring his son back to life. So he performs a creepy ritual in attempt to capture the Lord of Death so they can bring his son back to life in exchange for their release. But something goes wrong, and instead of capturing the Lord of Death, Tyrion captures Mr. Handsome Dude, who turns out to be Lord Morpheus, who is the king of the dreams realm. Huh? No, not that one. Although there's a lot of CGI dragons, they should have gone practical. So Tyrion commands his son, no, not the dead one, another one, to take Morpheus's / the Sandman's tools, which hold most of his power. And after Morpheus is fully stripped, I don't need to censor that, he goes on to take Morpheus's helm himself, which basically looks like a plague doctor cosplaying a mosquito. And after Tyrion finds out that this is not the Lord of Death, he decides to make do and asks Handsome Dude to give him some type of power or gift in exchange for his release. But Handsome Dude has a huge ego, and instead of coming to some type of agreement, he refuses to talk and just mopes. And he keeps moping for like 100 years till some klutz accidentally breaks the circle that was trapping him. So once he gets out, he punishes his captures, and then he goes to get his tools, but finds out that while he was imprisoned, someone stole his tools, which stored most of his power. Turns out that cosplaying as a mosquito wasn't a fashion statement after all. So for the next few episodes, he's on a chase for his tools, which one of them ended up being in literal hell. And after a journey of revenge, he ends up gathering all his tools. And I'm going to skip over episode 5, which was basically a short horror film, but it was pretty good. So we're back to the present, where you see Handsome Dude, who now we know is Lord Morpheus, is moping on a bench. And then he's approached by this young woman who strikes a conversation with him to see why is he moping. And he explains to her that after being trapped for over 100 years, the only thing that kept him going was his thoughts of revenge. But now that he's achieved his revenge and gathered all his tools, he feels like he lost his purpose. So after Morpheus opens up to this fine young lady, how does she respond? Well,
you are utterly the stupidest, most self-centered, pathetic excuse for an anthropomorphic television or Mace or any other play.
Yep. Then suddenly, a ball flies towards the woman, and she no luck catches it like some freaking anime protagonist. Anyways, she tells Sandman she has work to do, and if he wants, he can join her. And that's when we find out she's Morpheus's older sister. So, as they walk, one thing is apparent. Where Morpheus is dark and gloomy and generally doesn't get along with people, his sister is the exact opposite. She doesn't stop smiling at people, and when she tries to buy an apple from a store, the seller gives it to her for free because she's so likable. And that's when they reach their first destination. They enter a house where an old person is playing a violin. And instead of the dude screaming that two people just broke into his house, he apologizes if he made too much noise. Which either means he's a saint or he's absolutely senile. Probably the latter. So then she leans in and he realizes who she really is. And he pleads with her that he's not ready. And she tells him it's time. And that's when you realize who she really is. She is Death. And the one big thing that struck me about her, if you ask me, I would say Death is cruel and harsh and generally isn't good with people. Here, on the other hand, she's kind and compassionate to people. Anyways, they move on to the next guy. And as they deliver the news to him, it's genuinely sad. First of all, he has an American accent, and it turns out he's on a honeymoon with his wife. And instead of begging for his life or begging for another chance, all he asks for is 5 minutes so he can give his wife the code to his phone, which happens to have all their flight information, and without it, she'll be stuck abroad. And as people pull the guy's corpse out of the water, Death holds his hand and leads him away. And I love the small touch where she puts a compassionate hand on his back. Later on, when Morpheus asks her, how is she able to keep doing this? She answers she has a job to do. Which brings me back to when Morpheus said he lost his purpose. So here she's basically saying she does it not because it's her purpose, but because it's her function. And then she continues by saying how she almost gave up once because she felt like she was becoming hard and brittle inside. And that's when she came to a realization that all people, when they die, they feel hurt and shaken and confused. And she eventually learned that all people need is a kind word and a friendly face like they had at the beginning. And just as she finishes that sentence, the camera pans to a baby in a cot. When I tell you, I literally screamed at my monitor. No! Back to what she was saying. So you know how she said her function was to lead the dead? But by being a kind face and a friendly presence to the deceased, she found her purpose beyond her function. Anyways, the baby dies. She goes on to explain that when she leads the dead, she's not doing the job by herself, because when she's holding the deceased's hand, they're also holding hers. She's never alone when she's doing her job, and neither is Morpheus, who is in charge of dreams. And she carries on by saying, the reason they exist, her and Morpheus, is to serve humans, and it's not about finding purpose outside their functions. Their purpose is their function. And not only that, humans need them as much as they need humans. Mic drop. So, after saying their goodbyes, Morpheus is walking through the street, and you could see the effect she had on him, because you actually see him trying to smile at someone that's leaving a store, and the guy literally goes straight back inside, and his face becomes grim again, which kind of shows how lonely he probably is. Anyways, he ends up at a rundown bar and transforms into Snape's son, which basically turns out to be a flashback to 400 years before. And yep, he was a gloomy punk wannabe back then as well, just less handsome. Turns out Death dragged him along so he can see what humans are like in their own environment. And that's when we overhear a guy talking about how death is stupid, and the only reason people die is because they expected that they were going to die and are just going along with it. But him, on the other hand, won't, because he's not going to accept the status quo. Which is kind of funny because I remember someone in my class back when I was in school said the exact same thing, as if no one has ever thought of this before. Or maybe he was right, and all the people who did it in the past are still alive and are like in some type of club, but the only reason they don't share it with the rest of us is because then the world will become overcrowded. So Morpheus is confused why any being will crave an eternity in this hellhole we call Earth. So Death proposes to grant the man his wish.
And he will be begging for death within a century, I assure you.
So Morpheus tells the guy he will meet him again in the exact same location in 100 years' time. And Morpheus, you know what? From now I'm calling him Morphe. So Morphe, who doesn't quite understand humans and their resilience, thinks when they'll meet again in a century, the dude will beg for death. And with the coolest transition, 100 years pass. And Morpheus meets the dude and asks him about his experience. And the dude is called Rob, by the way. And gloomy Morphe, who has a very low understanding of humans and in general is a downer, expects the guy to say that it's hell and beg for his death. But no, the guy tells him,
It's fucking brilliant.
Although he himself hasn't been doing anything special and has been doing much of what he's done before, it's amazing being part of society as it evolves so quickly. And with some surprise, Morpheus leaves. And with another cool transition, this time Rob appears how I expected someone who lived for 200 years. Insanely rich. Not only that, he has a wife who is pregnant and a young child, and he tells Morpheus that the current world is what he once expected heaven to look like. It's safe to walk the streets, plenty of food, plenty of wine, and life is just so rich. And then Morpheus for some reason meets a young Shakespeare and makes a deal with him, which has no relevance to the plot, but it happened, I guess. And after another awesome transition, we are now at the Pirate of Caribbean era. This time, Morphe is already at the table waiting for Rob, which shows how him meeting Rob went from something he checked on out of curiosity to something he looked forward to. And this is when we see Rob, and unlike last time they meet, he's disheveled and dirty. The first thing he does as he sits at the table is down his drink in a desperation of someone who hasn't had the option in years. And as he's devouring his food, he points out that one of the downsides to being an immortal is that you can't die of starvation. As time went on, he got hungrier and hungrier. And he goes on to explain how shortly after their meeting, his wife died at childbirth, and later on his son died in a bar fight. And then the commoners who fear the supernatural noticed that he wasn't aging, so they took all his gold and burned down his house with him still in it. And then he goes on to say that he hated every second of the last 80 years.
Every bloody second.
So Morphe, who for the first time has a sad face instead of his gloomy usual, which you can actually see he's sad for Rob and for the fact that he's never gonna see him again, asks him the same question: does he still wish to live? And Rob responds, "Are you crazy? I have so much to live for." And you could see by Morpheus's reaction, and rather than just being amused by Rob, he's genuinely impressed with the human spirit and our will to live. 1 century later, this time the scene starts with them both already sitting, which shows that they were both genuinely looking forward to seeing each other. Anyways, this time Rob is a merchant, and let's just say he's planning to take a certain type of cargo from Africa to America. Yep, which Morphe points out is not very nice and advises him not to do it, which Rob points out rather correctly that for the first time in 400 years, he suddenly decides to give him advice, which is very interesting because till now, Morpheus let him live his life as he pleased and didn't get involved, so when he asks him if he still wants to live, his answer will be unbiased. But now that suddenly changes, which I think is because now he starts to see Rob more as a friend, and it bothers him if he does something wrong. And you may say that the reason he spoke up this time was because Rob was doing something bad. But early on, Rob said that he engaged in banditry and bribery among other things, and never once did it seem to bother Morpheus. Anyways, Rob takes his advice. And another cool transition, this time a match cut. This time you see Rob owns the bar. And as they sit to talk, instead of their usual where Morpheus inquires Rob about his life, for the first time, they actually have a genuine conversation. And by the expression on Morpheus's face, you could actually see that he's enjoying it. But then of course, Rob had to ruin it. He starts by coming up with a good point, that by now, Morphe knows he'll never seek death, which means the reason he keeps coming is because he sees Rob as a friend and he's lonely. Which Rob doesn't have a problem saying because he probably feels the same way. But Morpheus, who has a pretty big ego, doesn't see it that way. And he has the whole, "You dare suggest that someone like me needs you?" type speech, and he storms off to prove that he doesn't need his companionship, which shows his childishness, that he can't admit he is lonely, which I feel like happens a lot of times to older people, where they're too stubborn to admit to their children that they're lonely and end up pushing them away because they can't admit to others or themselves that they have become dependent on those who used to be dependent on them. Anyways, Rob tells Morpheus as he storms off that he will be waiting for him in 100 years, and if he shows up, it's only because they're friends. And as 100 years pass, Rob sits and waits at the bar, and waits, and waits, but Morphe never shows up. But what Rob doesn't know is at that very moment, Morphe is trapped in a huge crystal ball in Tyrion Lannister's house. And now we're back to the present, where Morpheus is standing in front of an abandoned building that turns out to be the inn they used to meet in. But before Morphe totally loses hope, he notices an arrow pointing towards a new inn. So as he finds the new inn and he walks into the new inn, he sees Rob in the corner of the room. And at this point, when I was watching this, I was smiling from ear to ear, and Morpheus was also doing his equivalent of smiling ear to ear. Rob tells him, "You're late," and Morpheus responds with the most wholesome line.
I've always had it impolite to keep one's friends waiting.
What a beautiful ending to a beautiful episode. But no! They decide to show this huge statue that looks like Statue of Liberty, where there's a beating heart in it, and in that beating heart, there's someone called Desire, who while being in the room by themselves goes on some evil rant, and in the end has his own version of an evil smile. And by the way, Desire's a great villain, but after one of the best hours of cinema I've ever watched, the scene was so goofy. Like, I know you want to reveal a new villain so people will keep binging your show, but you could have showed that in the start of the next episode. Like, I'll have to be crazy not to continue watching the show after watching this masterpiece. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video where I tried to sound smart and probably talked out of my tuchus. If you enjoyed this video, leave it a like. Have a good day.